पृथिवी शान्तिरन्तरिक्षगं शान्तिर्द्यौः शान्तिर्दिशः शान्तिरवान्तर दिशा शान्तिरग्निः शान्तिर्वायुः शान्तिरादित्यः शान्तिश्चन्द्रमा शान्तिर्नक्षत्राणि शान्तिरापः शान्तिरोषधयः शान्तिर्वनस्पतयः शान्तिर्गौ शान्तिरजा शान्तिरश्वः शान्तिः पुरुषः शान्तिर्ब्रह्म शान्तिर्ब्राह्मणः शान्तिः शान्तिरेव शान्तिः शान्तिर्मे astu shantihi. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra sukhinas santu. Sarve santu niramayaha. Sarve bhadrani pashyantu. Ma kaschit dukkha bhag bhavet. Sarvastaratu durgani. Sarvo bhadrani pashyatu. Sarvas satbuddhimapnotu. Sarvas sarvatra nandatu. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our own hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om. It's my great joy and privilege to welcome Father Francis Clooney of Harvard University. Most of you have had a chance to hear him before. Father Clooney has had a very long association with the Vedanta Society since the time of my predecessor, Swami Sarvagatananji. And I have had the honor to have known him for close to, not yet 30 years, right? Almost 30 years. He's been a very dear friend, and he's a professor of comparative theology. And in fact, he's one of the pioneers in the field of comparative theology. He is respected not only as a great scholar, but above all as a true seeker of truth. I have known him personally as a spiritual seeker. He has known him. He has written many books. His latest book is called Learning Interreligiously. I would encourage all of you to take a look. It's his reflections that have appeared periodically in his blog. His blog is on the inner edge, and the thoughts and reflections. I'm a very regular reader of his blog, and I have found them very enlightening and very informative. So Father Clooney will speak with us today on Easter and human transformation. Please welcome Father Clooney.
Good morning. When Swami originally invited me to come, it was for last Sunday, for Easter. And I was unable to come because of my duties in the parish, the church that I help out in on the weekends. But we realized beforehand that today is Easter in the Orthodox tradition, the Eastern churches. So we still have an Easter visit, so I think it works out well. And Swami mentioned that I had come here as long ago as 30 years ago when Swami Sarvagatananda was the Swami. And he found recently some photos from those days. I was certainly much younger looking 30 years ago, but it was very nice to have a reminiscence of those days long ago. And I'm very happy to be with you again this morning. So Easter is, of course, the major feast of the Christian year. It's a time of celebration, of the triumph of life over death, love and peace over hatred and violence, light over darkness. And it's the end of the long season of Lent, a time of penance and reflection in the Christian churches, preparation for the holy days that occurred for us last week this time. Holy Thursday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and then the light and joy of Easter morning. And as you know, many people will gather somewhere where hopefully the sun will rise and there won't be clouds, so probably not New England, but there will be a sense of with the rising sun is the rising Christ. And one of the themes I think about Easter, because we take it for granted, Lent is a time of penance and withdrawal and extra service and fasting and so on, and then Easter is simply joy. But I think the church, my Catholic church to which I belong, gives us 40 or 50 days more to try to bring alive the meaning of Easter. So we have the 40 days from Easter Sunday to Ascension Thursday. We hear in the Acts of the Apostles, after 40 days, Jesus was taken up into heaven. And then 10 days later, the Feast of Pentecost, the coming of the Holy Spirit on the community. And I think it was a reminder in the calendar of the year that this understanding of the risen Christ is not so obvious. I mean, in some sad way, we know what it means to suffer. We know what it means to die. We know what violence is. We know how people's lives can be taken apart by violence. But what does it mean to say the grave is open and the body has risen and that we are called from death to life? I think the calendar is really telling us, don't take for granted you know what Easter is about. Don't take for granted joy, peace, happiness. No, you need to think about this over a period of time. And that, I think, is what the Easter season is for. One of the ways that this has been talked about over the centuries is this problem of the possibility of seeing Jesus and seeing him as risen. But the same Jesus who had died on the cross is risen, and so with the marks of the nails in his hands and the spear in his side, how is it possible to see him after the resurrection? One of the oldest passages we have is from 1 Corinthians 15. So St. Paul, writing before the Gospels were written, the first books of the New Testament were his letters. So 20, 30 years after the death of Jesus, he writes these words in 1 Corinthians. I have handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received from my elders, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with Scripture. And importantly, then he appeared to Peter, and then to the 12 apostles. And then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom were still alive, though some have died. And then he appeared to James and to all the apostles. And there's this memory, very cherished and very sacred in this earliest church, that the Jesus who rose, there were witnesses. There were people who saw that he rose from the dead. There were people still living in our midst in this early church who can talk about the experience of the risen Christ. And he's trying to hold on to that. Paul, being someone who did not meet Jesus personally, in his earliest career, he was actually a persecutor of the Christian church. He thought it was some kind of a heresy within the Jewish faith and tried to stamp it down. But then he had his own experience of Christ, but never met Jesus before the crucifixion. And so he continues. He appeared to James and then to all the apostles, but last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. For I am the least of all the apostles, unfit to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and God's grace toward me has not been in vain. On the contrary, I work as hard as I can, and indeed harder than anybody else, though it was not I, but the grace of God working within me. And I think here it's a very important point that Paul is admitting he was not among Peter and the 12 and the 500 brothers and sisters and James and the others who had this direct experience, but that somehow it's been given to him in his generation, and that his job is to proclaim it and to bring it to the next generation. I think in every tradition there is always the time of the founder, the time of the genius of the original experience. But then how does that get passed down to the next generation, the next one, the next one, the next one? And people can begin to doubt and lose their way. I was thinking about this, obviously, in terms of Sri Ramakrishna and the tradition of Vedanta. And I thought, I've read, as Swami was saying, I've read a good bit of the Ramakrishna tradition over the years, the Gospel, the Great Master, and so on like that. But I was reading from this essay by Swami Vivekananda called My Master. And I'm sure many of you know this very well, where he reflects on who Ramakrishna was for him. But the whole theme of this reading, and I'll just read you a small part of it, was really about what does it mean for us to see God? So to see the risen Christ, to see God in the world. But what does it mean when people are saying, does God exist? Does God not exist? Is God empirically present? Can you prove the existence of God? Vivekananda, in his pre-monastic life, was one of those in Calcutta seeking and trying to figure out what exactly are we talking about when we talk about God. And so he hears about this man, Ramakrishna, and then comes to see him. So this man came to live near Calcutta, the capital of India, the most important university town in our country, which, however, was sending out skeptics and materialists by the hundreds every year. So universities are not cultivating the faith, but they're actually taking it away from people. Nothing has changed, probably. Yet many of these university people, skeptics and agnostics, nevertheless used to come out and listen to Ramakrishna. I heard of this man, and I myself went to hear him. He's rather disappointed because he says, he looked just like any other ordinary man. There was nothing remarkable about him. He used the most simple language, nothing fancy, no jargon. And I thought, how could this man be a great teacher? So I came very close to him, And I asked him the question which I've been asking others all my life. Sir, do you believe in God? And he replied simply, yes. And I asked him, can you prove it, sir? And he said, yes. And I said, well, how can you prove it? Because I see him just as I see you here, only in a much intenser sense. And that impressed me immediately. And I think this is the beginning, and this is Swami Vivekananda talking about his own spiritual journey. Suddenly he was in the presence of somebody who had this experience of God. You can say, well, does seeing mean literally eye to face? Or is it some kind of intense inner experience in the heart, in the mind, in the soul? Nevertheless, it seemed that finally Vivekananda, to be, had found somebody who could speak directly of his experience of God. And I think this is the problem at Easter for the earliest Christians. If you weren't one of the 12 apostles, if you weren't there in those first days, how could you imagine meeting Christ? Because if we have the book, if we have the doctrine, if we have the theology, if we have the church, if we have the masses and the rituals and so on, but no direct experience of Christ, then the whole thing gets very weak. It's sort of the outside, but not the inside. And I think this is really where I'd like to talk to you a little more today about how this was developed around the Easter theme in the earliest church. The Synoptic Gospels, as we call them, which are kind of overviews of the life of Christ, Mark and Matthew and Luke, all end with these stories of the risen Christ. And I'm sure that many of you know these stories well. But we find in each of the Gospels, in Mark and Matthew and Luke, the phenomenon, first of all, the tomb is empty. And sometimes you see on Easter cards and so on like that, Jesus kind of striding out of the tomb and kind of light around him and angels and so on like that. None of that's in the Gospels. The first experience of the risen Christ is in emptiness. The tomb is empty, he's not there, we don't see him. Then what? And the women who first come to the tomb in Matthew and Mark, they're surprised and they're a bit afraid. There's something very unusual here. What is going on? And they decide to run back into town and to hide out, because not only is he dead, but now the body has been taken. Somebody took the body. But as they're on the road going back in, famously in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus suddenly stands there before them on the road, and they're amazed. And he tells them, I told you that I would die and rise. Why are you so puzzled? And he says, go into the city and tell my brothers that I have risen and that I will come to see them. Similarly, in Luke, we have beautiful stories of the risen Jesus. The most famous beautiful story, I think, in Luke's Gospel is the two people, possibly two men, maybe a man and a woman, going to the small town of Emmaus, which is approximately 7 miles away from Jerusalem. Namely, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, they didn't call it Easter Sunday. Several days later, they say, I guess it's over. And they're heading back home, they're walking the 7 miles, they're talking kind of glumly about how they had great hopes and nothing has happened. And suddenly this man comes up walking aside them. And he walks next to them, and as I think travelers would do, he says to them, what have you been talking about as you walk along the road? And they say to him, the things that have been happening in Jerusalem, of course. What else would we be talking about? And he says, well, what happened in Jerusalem? I must have missed it. And they say, well, are you the only person who doesn't know what happened to Jesus of Nazareth? How this good man who preached good news, who healed the sick, who raised the dead, he was arrested and put on trial and condemned and hung on the cross and died. Have you not heard this? And in very poignant words, they say, we had hoped that he was the one to come. And now he's gone. And they say, we're just walking home. And Jesus, they don't know who it is. They can't see this person directly. They're standing with him, they're walking with him. And he says, well, aren't there these passages in Scripture that talk about suffering and death and resurrection being uplifted by God? And he begins to talk to them about all the things that in the Scripture the Christian church will take to be about Jesus, all the Jewish stories, prophecies, and so on. And you know how the story ends. They get to Emmaus, and then he says goodnight, and he starts to walk away. And so then for a crucial moment, do we just say goodnight and that's the end of it? And they say, no, come in with us. Come in and have a meal with us. And he comes in and sits down, and they have the bread and the wine, and he breaks the bread for them, very Eucharistic, just like communion. He breaks the bread, and suddenly they realize who it is. And suddenly he's gone from their midst. And suddenly they say, it was Jesus. Our hearts were burning in us as we walked along the road. Our lives had been changed. We didn't even know it. Slowly, 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 as he walked with us, we had no idea who this was. And suddenly he was opening the scripture for us. Suddenly our hearts and minds became back to life again. And suddenly they realize in the breaking of the bread, as the church does every Sunday, the communion rite, we found him again. And having come all the way from Jerusalem out to Emmaus, they say, it's night now, but let's go back and tell them. And they apparently run all the way back to Jerusalem. So it's not a marathon, it's only 7 miles. But nonetheless, at night, a long way to go in the dark. And they go back and they tell the apostles. So we have all these stories about the risen Christ and who saw him and who didn't see him. And I think in some ways, again, for me, it echoes, what does it mean to see God? And what was Swamiji's understanding when Ramakrishna said, I see God so clearly, I see him more clearly than I see you. I see him more clearly than I see my hand before my face. What is this all about? And I think one of the genius insights that we have in the New Testament is that there are two ways of looking at this. One way is to look and to say, this is an objective reality. Is Jesus there? Is Jesus walking by us? Does Jesus come into the upper room? Does Jesus stand there with us? Do we see him or not? Does he disappear? Is the tomb empty? Where is he? But I think the early church began to realize fairly quickly that it's much more a state of mind about the risen Christ. That in a sense, as with the two men along the road, the risen Christ is around you. The risen Christ is here. The risen Christ is with us. And yet our eyes are blocked. We can't see him. And so Jesus is risen, Jesus is near. He's not something that happened 2,000 years ago only, but Jesus is alive. And the earliest church saying, well, what's the problem? The problem is in the head. The problem is the blockages in our heart. We haven't been ourselves enlightened. We haven't ourselves been raised up to a new insight. And so we can't see him anymore. And so I think the most important for this aspect, the kind of, you might say, the subjective side of the resurrection, we find in the Gospel according to John. John chapter 20. And I'll say a little thing at the end about John chapter 21. But John's Gospel, as you know, is the last of the 4 Gospels. It was probably written another generation after the others. So if Luke and Matthew were written around 70, Jesus died by tradition in 33. Around 70, then maybe 100 or even after 100. John's Gospel was written. We call it the Gospel of John, the beloved disciple. Many scholars say that it may not literally have been written by John the Apostle, but in his tradition, but nonetheless written later. And I think if you take this seriously, John looking back over the past 50, 60, 70 years, and thinking about the testimonies of Paul, who talks about the many people who saw the risen Christ, and talking about these beautiful stories in Mark and Matthew and Luke, is saying, well, what do we do now? Time has passed. The people who knew Jesus directly are dying off one by one. How do we keep this alive in our generation, not simply as a nice memory from years ago, but in our lifetime? And I think it pertains for the churches right now. So 2,000 years later, is it just an increasingly fading memory in a secular culture? Jesus rose from the dead, but it's so long ago, we can barely even imagine it anymore. The chapter, I'll give you a spoiler, so if you want to cover your ears if you don't want to hear it. The chapter ends with John making the point about living on in the Word in the community. And this is what he says at the end of the chapter. Now Jesus did many signs in the presence of his disciples, but I have not written them all down in this book. namely the book of the gospel. But these have been written down so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. And what rather audaciously the author of this gospel, and we can call him John, is saying is that what was given in the beginning to certain eyewitnesses and people who had this intense experience of seeing Jesus after the resurrection was eventually put into words that were passed by word of mouth from one person to another to another. And then people like me, John is saying, I wrote down some of what I heard. He says at the end of chapter 21, if I wrote down everything I heard, there would not be enough room in the entire world for all the books that I would write. Maybe a little bit of an exaggeration, but nonetheless. This idea that there's more and more and more that can be written. But what I've written here is that by hearing this word and believing it, then you can have life within you. And I think then what John does and what we have, that's the end of the chapter, all the chapter 20 of John that we have leading up to this final claim is really about how people go from objective experience, the tomb is empty, so where is he? To a realization that the problem is not the tomb empty or not, the stone there or not, to rather this understanding, what's going on in my head, what's going on in my heart, are my eyes spiritually open or not? And this realization that something has to change. So I'll just go through briefly the chapter for you, and if you know the chapter, this will just be a refresher course, but it's a beautiful chapter. So at the beginning of John chapter 20, unlike the other Gospels, just one person comes out to the tomb on Sunday morning, namely Mary Magdalene. The other Gospels talk about the women come out together to the tomb. But in John's Gospel, it's narrowed down simply to one person. And the other Gospels say, well, the women came out to the tomb with spices and herbs and oils to properly prepare the body, because there was such a rush on Friday for the Passover beginning. They just basically, wrapped the body up and put it in the tomb. Now they want to do it properly. But in John's Gospel, there's no mention of any practical reason, nothing about ointments and new cloths and so on like that. It's just that Mary comes out to the tomb. And I think, as we'll see in the sequel, I think Mary stands for the person who instinctively knows where to be. So it's not a practical matter. It's not a matter of some job to be done. Nobody told her to go. But instinctively, she goes to the last place where she found Jesus before, which I think is always good in our spiritual life. Where have we found God in our lives before? Where has God spoken to us, touched us, either yesterday or 40 years ago? There's always some point in our life when we have these vivid stories and vivid memories of God touching us to go there. And John puts it in these simple terms. Just as dawn was breaking, Mary went out to the tomb. And she gets there and she sees the stone has been rolled back, and she looks in and sees that the tomb is empty. And again, this is the stark way that the resurrection begins in all these stories. Again, no light, no striding out, no angels, no noise, nothing. It's just that the stone has been rolled back and the tomb is empty. And she kind of stands there and she looks and says, what is this all about? And she decides, I've got to tell somebody. So she goes back into the city, and it's probably, a half a mile, a quarter mile away. It's not, the geography means this is not a very long space. But she goes back in and she finds Peter, and then the disciple whom Jesus loved, who's probably John, and she tells them, the tomb is open, the stone has been rolled back, the body is missing. Because she doesn't know. Come and see. So in a sense, Mary is the first one to preach the gospel. She's of the risen Christ, even though she doesn't know what she's talking about. She gets them to come out, and it says they come running out to the tomb. And for some strange reason, which I've never figured out, it says the younger one, John, runs faster and gets there first, and Peter is dragging along behind. There may be something about Peter. The church is always, the papal function is always dragging behind the others. Who knows? But they get to the tomb, and then John looks into the tomb. He doesn't go in. He looks in and sees, oh, yep, it's empty. And then Peter comes and goes rushing right into the tomb and looks and sees that one cloth, the shroud, has been wrapped up in one spot, and the cloth that had been wrapped around the head is in another spot. And he agrees, yes, this tomb is definitely empty. And then the first disciple, John, also goes into the tomb and looks around, and it says he believes. And yet it adds in the gospel, he did not yet understand because they did not know what it meant for Jesus to rise from the dead. So what did he believe if he didn't understand anything? It seemed that he finally believed that Mary was telling the truth. It's almost like a humorous aside. Peter and John have to go to the tomb and look in and then go in and kind of look at the cloth and say, yep, there's nobody here. I guess she was telling the truth. And they believe Mary's word. And again, but they don't understand what has happened really. So what do? Do they become the great apostles who go out and preach the gospel to all nations? No, it says after this scene, Peter and John simply go back each to his own home. So they're not together. They're back in Jerusalem, each one in his own place. So again, a kind of the experience of the empty tomb. Mary, the first preacher of the emptiness of the tomb, and therefore the risenness of Christ. The two apostles, two leading figures, see this, and the great climax of this is then they walk back into Jerusalem and go home and maybe go back to bed, or who knows what they do. Nothing really. But the instinctive thing, and again, John is teaching us by this scene, the final part of this first scene of chapter 20, is that Mary doesn't go back, but rather Mary stays there at the tomb. And it's a beautiful sentiment because, again, Mary is the one who instinctively went. She was there because she wanted to be there. She'd be there even if the body was simply in the grave. She had this instinct about where to be. And when they come and look and they verify she's telling the truth, they say, well, there's no reason to stay, and they just go back into the city. But she stays. Like, again, this was the last place where he was. I'm not leaving. And who knows how long she would have stayed there. So she stays there weeping at the tomb, it says. And then suddenly there's someone standing next to her. It's a little bit like in the Luke gospel I told you about the two people on the road. There's suddenly somebody there, but she doesn't pay attention to them. You say, oh, it's the gardener. He's coming to clean up or something like that. And then she realizes, well, maybe he knows. She turns to him and says, Sir, do you know where they put the body? Again, so she's talking to this person next to her, thinking that this person might know something about where the body is. And of course, it's Jesus. He's there next to her. He's immediately with her. And it's not as if Jesus is not present, but Jesus is present. Jesus is always present. It's just that the people even closest to him don't yet understand that. And they're looking, is he in the tomb? Is he up there? Is he gone somewhere else? How are we to know? And he's standing right there, and she thinks it's just the gardener. But I'll read you one little section, the following section, which is quite beautiful. So after she asks, Mr. Gardener, where is the body? Jesus said to her, Woman, why are you weeping? Who are you looking for? Again, supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, Sir, if you have carried the body away, tell me where you have laid it, and I will go there myself. So again, just tell me where the body is. That's where I want to be. Let me go to that place. And Jesus kind of brushes aside that question and simply says to her, Mary. And I think John gets it to the simplest possible thing. No long explanation, nothing like on the road to Emmaus where the word is being spelled out and the preachings and the prophecies and all that. But he simply calls her by her personal name. So no description of Magdalene, nothing about her past life, none of that. He just calls her by name, and suddenly she realizes, and she turns to him and says, Rabbi, teacher. And I think for John, this is again the point, is that it's not, again, and I'm repeating myself, as if Jesus is not present or Jesus is not nearby. The resurrection means he's not limited to one place only, and certainly not to the past. But there has to be some kind of a personal crossover. And for her, unlike the two apostles, if John and Peter had stayed there, he might have called them by name too. But they didn't. They went back. And so as soon as there's this direct personal contact, the first words Jesus speaks after rising from the dead is the word Mary to this woman. And suddenly she realizes and says, "You are my Lord, you are my teacher, you are my rabbi, you are my everything." And I think John is trying to say, well, how do we find out what's going on? You have to be the right kind of person. You have to be the person who sticks with it and doesn't run away when it gets confusing. And you have to be the kind of person who listens to somebody who knows more than you do. And so Peter and John got half the story. The woman is right, the tomb is empty, but that was the end of it, and so they didn't get the sequel. Scene 2 in the chapter, which we heard in many of the Christian churches this morning, or I was in church yesterday, is in the upper room, and here the disciples are gathered on that same night. So what we would say today, the night of the resurrection, the night of Easter. The apostles are gathered in the upper room, and Jesus suddenly appears in their midst. And they make the point, John, that the doors are locked, the windows are locked, because they don't know what's happening, if they're going to be arrested or anything like that. So they're there in the room, they're perhaps praying or just eating a meal, or both. And suddenly Jesus is with them, and he knows that they're afraid, so he says, "Don't be afraid, peace be with you." And they're still afraid, so then he says, "Peace be with you," a second time to them. And then he says, "I give you the Holy Spirit." And it's not 40 to 50 days later at Pentecost, but he kind of lays the Spirit upon them and says, "What you open shall be opened, what you close shall be closed. The Spirit of God is with you." So this has to be a powerful moment, that Jesus, they didn't come to him. They weren't like Mary who went to the tomb. They're kind of waiting for what? But Jesus shows up where they are and finds them, which is another spiritual point I think we can see in any tradition, your tradition, that if we don't find God, God will find us. And God will look for us and come to us where we are. Even if we've locked all the doors and the windows, God will come to us. God will be with us. So they have this overwhelming experience. The Spirit has come upon them. They've seen the risen Christ. And the sequel is the famous part, where one was missing, Thomas. The one we judge for all of history is doubting Thomas. Thomas was not there. And I think John, the evangelist, is sort of playing with the idea, how do you speak in a way that you can communicate the living word to somebody else? And so he comes back, and they tell him, "We saw the risen Lord. The risen Lord came here. He was here. He gave us peace. He gave us the Spirit. He's risen." And Thomas kind of looks at them and sort of says, "Well, I don't believe you. I don't believe this. I need to see him myself." Which must have been a letdown for the apostles. You know, we were the ones who walked with Jesus those years. We were with him at his miracles, with him with the Sermon on the Mount, with him when he made the multiplication of loaves and fishes, with him at the Last Supper. And we now tell you the good news, and like many preachers over the years, it falls flat. I don't believe you. And it could be something about Thomas. You know, he has his doors and windows closed. There's some obstacle in his life. He's kind of blocked the way. But I think it's also in John's Gospel on the other side, that probably they haven't really opened up their doors and windows. They haven't learned how to release the power of the Spirit. And so they don't get through to Thomas. So the sequel is a week later. I think many of you know this story. Jesus comes again and appears in the upper room. They're there again. And the doors and windows are locked. And he comes and stands in their midst and says, "Peace be with you." And this time Thomas is with them. So you have to imagine this as a slightly ironic scene, because then Jesus turns and looks at Thomas and says, "Well, Thomas, you're here this time." And he holds out his hand and says, "Well, there's the nail hole. If you want to stick your finger in it, you said you wanted to. Why don't you go ahead?" Which is embarrassing for Thomas. I mean, he was being rhetorical. I don't think he meant it literally. And he must have lifted his cloak and said, "Well, there's the spear mark, the cut in my side. If you want to stick your hand in, go ahead." And I think, again, in John's Gospel, this is in some way dealing with our yearning, because it's for all ages, of wanting some palpable, final, complete, absolute certainty about God. I'm sort of what Vivekananda was looking for. Have you ever seen God? And I think we're getting the sense that, in some sense, people say, I'll believe if I see it myself, if I can put my finger into the nail hole and my hand into the side. And Jesus says, okay, go ahead. It's time you can do it. And I think then Thomas realizes this is not the way to do it. And it doesn't say whether he did or not. Maybe he did, but it doesn't say anything about that. But rather that he simply says, my Lord and my God. And he probably, all the pictures always show him falling to his knees. That suddenly he realizes he's in the presence of the risen one. And he realizes, my Lord and my God is here. And again, I think John is saying, those palpable signs you want, the proof, the scientific proof of resurrection, put it aside. When Jesus is there in the community, when Jesus comes and is in your midst, then you realize who it is, my Lord and my God. But again, Jesus pushes it a little bit further by saying, finally, easy for you, you see, and that's why you believe. Blessed are those who have not seen and still believe. And I think, again, John is in this, it's kind of a tutorial about resurrection, again, written the year 100 or after the year 100. What do you do, like most Christians for most of history, if you haven't seen, if you haven't had the direct experience? Learn to believe the living word that's been given to you. I have written these words down in this book that you may believe, that you may have life, and that you may know the Lord. And there's a sense here, can Thomas stand in for us who have this greater experience? Now, I was thinking about this. I have a couple more things to say about the Gospel of John, but I am, as Swami said, a comparativist, and I'm therefore always thinking across boundaries between the Hindu and the Christian world. And if I'm speaking to a Christian group, I'll always eventually bring something from Hindu wisdom in. And I'd like to do the same for you. I've been talking, it's Easter time, so I've been talking about the gospel. But I was thinking, what resonates with me further in Hindu tradition about this problem of seeing and learning to see properly? I've already quoted the beautiful passage about Swami Vivekananda, and I'll give you the end of that passage in a few minutes. But I was thinking, I've been teaching a course at Harvard this semester on Krishna and Christ. It's supposed to be an undergraduate course. It's mainly grad students. But I'm learning all kinds of things. If any of you who teach, that you don't really understand the topic until you teach it. So it comes to life when you're teaching it. And we're reading early in the course part of the Bhagavad Purana, Canto 10, the 10th book of the Bhagavad Purana, the great stories of the child Krishna, the boy Krishna, the young man Krishna, the butter thief, the Krishna Yashoda looks into his mouth and sees the universe, Krishna who dances with the cowherd girls and is always being, attacked by demons and so on like that. So it's the most famous part of the Bhagavad Purana. And I was thinking of that and realized that one part of it resonated with me, chapters like 39 to 41, where akrura comes in. So krura means cruel, and akrura means not cruel. And he comes in as like an incidental character around chapter 39 because King Kamsa, who's the arch enemy of Krishna, wants to kill Krishna. And his strategy, which doesn't seem very clever to me, having sent all these demons which keep getting knocked over by Krishna, he says, well, I'll get them to come here, Krishna and his brother Balaram. I'll get them to come here, and then I'll kill them. So he calls his uncle in, Akrura, who apparently is just a figure in the palace, and says, take your chariot, go to where Krishna is, and just bring him back and saying the king would like to see you. Come and have dinner with the king or something like that. So go and get the king. But it turns out that this becomes a moment of spiritual enlightenment for Akrura, because he's just supposed to do this job. He's chosen only because he's the uncle of Kamsa and therefore presumably trustworthy. He can do this. But as soon as he gets in his chariot and starts driving to where Krishna is, he suddenly realizes, I never realized it, but this is what I've wanted for my whole life. And without any background, that I've looked through the earlier chapters, there's no background in Bhagavad Purana about Akrura before this scene, but that suddenly something has been woken, something has woke up in him. And he realizes, I want to see Krishna. And there's a long chapter, which we don't have time to read, but he talks about Krishna. I've heard of Krishna, I've heard the deeds of Krishna, I heard the beauty of his face, I've heard about the beauty of his playing the flute, his lotus feet, and so on and so on and so on. And even though my nephew Kamsa has the worst of motives to kill Krishna, he's given me the greatest opportunity of my life to go and see him. And so he reaches where Krishna is, and the first thing he does, he sees footprints in the ground. And he says, the footprints of Krishna. And of course, footprints, we have no idea if these are actually the footprints of Krishna, but nonetheless, footprints, as in the Buddhist tradition, when you can't see the Buddha, you can see the trail of the Buddha, the footprints of the Buddha, where the Buddha was. And he sees the footprints of the Buddha, of Krishna, and says, well, I don't have the direct experience I'm looking for yet, but he jumps out of his chariot and throws himself on the ground and rolls around in the dust, saying, the dust is sacred because it's the dust from the feet of Krishna. And in some ways, this again, I think, is the teaching in the Bhagavad Purana, getting literally closer and closer to seeing God. So you're doing your business, you're in the palace, suddenly you get sent on a mission, suddenly while you're driving your chariot, everything comes alive. And then the first thing you see is the footprint and you roll in the dust. And he must have looked a real mess because he's rolling in the, very strange also, he's rolling in the dust and shows up here in a royal chariot and then is rolling in the dust. But then he does go and he asks his way and he finds Krishna and Balaram. And something like one of the early scenes in the Gospel of John, in chapter 1, these men start following Jesus on the beach. And he turns around and looks at them and says, well, what do you want? What are you looking for? And they say to him, where do you live? Like, I think they don't know what to say. So he says, come and see. And they go with him and they spend hours in his house and they apparently have a meal with him. A very simple starting point. Here he shows up at Krishna and he's just going to worship Krishna and Balaram and just sort of stand there like a statue. But apparently they both come up, as the text says, they come up, they embrace him, and then they draw him in, and they sit him down, and they wash his feet, and they give him ointments and flowers and so on like that, and then they feed him. And he's totally surprised at the intimacy that he didn't expect he gets. And again, it goes deeper and deeper and deeper. But after that scene, they talk a bit about, and then he confesses why he's come, to bring them back so that his nephew can kill them. And Krishna said, oh, don't worry about that. I'll take care of that when I get there. But I think he must look at himself and say, well, I'm rather dusty now. Do you mind if I take a bath? And he leaves them, sadly leaves them because he can't bear to leave Krishna and Balaram, and goes down to the river to take his bath. So they're there, he's here, he's away from Krishna, and many of you I'm sure know this story. He then, when he plunges into the water, he realizes that Krishna is there under the water. And he sees Krishna, and he sees not only the Krishna who is sitting back there, but he sees Krishna in all his glory as the Lord of the universe, surrounded by celestial beings. And he suddenly realizes, oh my God, he's come and now he's here. And I think in some ways, it's a token that having been with Krishna, having found Krishna, he leaves Krishna, and suddenly Krishna is where he is. He finds him in this new place. And then he brings his head above the water and said, I was just imagining that, and then plunges again, and Krishna is there again. And he does it a third time, and Krishna is there, and he has a long hymn of praise, either under the water or out of the water, praising Krishna. And then suddenly Krishna is gone. And then he finishes up his bath and goes back and saying, well, now Krishna is here, so Krishna won't be there. I don't know where Krishna is. But he goes back, and they're just sitting there on the couch as they were before he went for his bath. And they're not soaking wet. Krishna doesn't look like he's just been in the river. And I think the point of this in the Bhagavad Purana is a teaching of Akrura, but of teaching anyone who hears the Bhagavata story. You have to learn how to find Krishna so that you can see Krishna. Krishna is instrumental in your life. Your nephew wants to kill him, so you have a job to do. You're in your chariot, you're desiring him, he appears in your mind. You roll yourself in the dust, you sit with him at table. You see him in the river, you come back and see him again. And it continues. We don't need the sequel here. But I think the point is, it resonated with me that as John is teaching the early church how to find the risen Christ by beginning to learn to trust the Mary Magdalens of this world, who have this instinct for God, and by learning that you don't have to have this scientific, clinical proof, the finger into the nail hole or the hand into the side, you go from being clueless, where you see an empty tomb and then you just go home, to having your spiritual consciousness awakened to find Christ, in some ways is like the story of finding Krishna. And it goes, I think I'll draw to a conclusion by going back to where I started, that the Easter season, the transformation that takes place at Easter, is not simply a doctrine about death and life, or darkness and light, or violence and peace, or hatred and love. All of that's very important. Or about 2,000 years ago, Jesus died on the cross and rose, and death has been overcome. And there were people who saw him back then. But John is kind of speaking to the reality in which we live by saying, where you are, the Christ will come. If you trust the word, if you trust your brothers and sisters to give you the word. And again, the passage I read at the beginning, Jesus did many signs in the presence of his disciples, but they are not all written in this book. But these have been written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. You might say the same about the Bhagavad Purana. These words are life. If you understand what happened to Akrura, then you begin to see how you can see God in your life. A footnote and then a final quote. In chapter 21, I mentioned to you that I would mention briefly chapter 21. The gospel seems to be over at the end of chapter 20 with the passage I just read, final. And some scholars say chapter 21 is just an add-on by some later person. But chapter 21, I think, is deliberately different because it's sort of back to, it's like Monday morning. Okay, back to work. It's over with. And Peter says, I'm tired, I'm restless. Actually, it's evening. Peter says, I think I'm going fishing. And he's a fisherman, so it's not like I'm just going to go out and have a holiday, but I'm going back to work. And he goes out fishing at night, and they spend the entire night in the boats trying to catch fish, and they can't catch any fish. There are no fish in the Sea of Galilee. And I think it's this kind of dreary sense of back to ordinary life. The Lord is risen, wonderful things have happened, he's appeared to us, and then you're back at work, and life is mundane and humdrum again, and nothing is working. And suddenly, as the sun is rising, they see a man on the shore, and John, the beloved disciple, says, that's Jesus. And Jesus has come to them in the midst of their ordinary, mundane life. Not in church, not in the upper room, not at the empty tomb, but back at work, at the lake, when the fish are not being caught, he's there. And he tells them, throw the net out on the other side of the boat, and they catch more fish so that the boat's almost sinking. But then his final word to them when they come on the shore is, I'm cooking you breakfast. Come and sit down. Bring me some of the fish to go with the bread and so on like that. And I think it's deliberately a mundane scene saying, we can make all of this very sanctified and holy, and it's all beautiful, and it's all perfect. But sometimes when you're back on ordinary life, God will be saying to you, just sit down, have breakfast with me. And I think John is saying, if you understand this gospel, it's not going to be about miracles and visions and apparitions and so on, but rather simply, where you are, Jesus will find you. If you're hungry, he will feed you. If your work is not going well, he will help you. And then you will know what it means that Jesus is risen. And I'll just conclude by reading the end of that scene I began with Swami Vivekananda. So Ramakrishna said, I see God more visibly, more vividly than I see you. And this is the end of it. Vivekananda reflects, for the first time in my life, I found a person who dared to say that he saw God, and that religion is a reality to be experienced, to be sensed in a more infinitely intense way than we can experience the world around us. I finally saw somebody who found it all together and just dared to say this to me. And so I began to go to that man day after day. I actually saw that religion could be given. One touch, one glance can change a whole life. And I think it's this kind of pass-me-down effect. One person is touched, touches another, says the word, said the word. You all know what happened to this young man who later became called Swami Vivekananda. And I think in the Christian tradition, those original disciples, Mary and Peter and John and Thomas, and here we all are today. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. That very, very informative and very inspiring, very uplifting reflection on the significance of Easter and what it can mean to us individually and collectively. Every time I hear you speak or whenever I read your books or your blogs, one thought that often comes to my mind is that if there are more people in this world who think the way you do, I think the world will be a much better place than it is. So we are very, very grateful to you for coming, and I hope you come again. Thank you. The rest of the week, our programs will be held as usual. On Wednesday, we will continue with the study of the Kathopanishad. On Tuesday, we'll have the meditation as usual at 6. This Saturday, upcoming Saturday, we will not have meditation. Next Sunday, we have a guest speaker. The Muslim chaplain at Harvard, Khalil Abdul Rashid, will speak to us on spiritual cultivation through fasting in Islam. I believe from next Monday, the Ramadan begins, so it will be an appropriate occasion for us to reflect on what significance fasting has in the Islamic tradition. So that's our program in the coming week. We'll conclude with a prayer now on page 3. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.